free to contribute from that standpoint too. I know you're here for you and receiving the information on interviewing, but your perspective is also very helpful for the audience here today. So Shay is going to drop the participant guide in the chat. You can say hello to her. She's on camera with me. And again, if you have any questions whatsoever about Zoom, about maybe the document, any of that, please let her know in chat. I do realize that if for some reason you're not able to unmute your call line, which during the session prefer you not to unless you raise your hand so that I know you're going to speak up. Otherwise, I probably would talk over you and don't realize it. But go ahead and just raise your hand or chat and say, I'd like to speak up. Okay. So with that, this is Upskill Your Interviewing Technique. And as we go through this information, you're going to find that there's some advanced content here. If you've been through any type of a course on interviewing, and I would imagine most of you have not, that's why you're here. That's why this is provided. But I want to encourage you to think about maybe even accessing, there might be some YouTube videos or something, little short clips of tips from recruiters that might be helpful to you as well. But we will talk about some advanced preparation strategy. We'll talk about types of interviews, the stages of the interview as you prepare, plan, and practice, and different kinds of questions that you're going to get, and then questions you might want to ask. We'll talk about specific, stages of the process, as I mentioned. We'll incorporate some tips on presenting your best self in that, and of course, thinking about how we communicate is important, body language, presentation, all that. And then post-interview guidelines, really after the interview, what you want to do to be successful, sort of as you're closing the interview, but then also the follow-up. So there's plenty of interview tips, and also in the guide that you're receiving, your participant guide, it was just dropped in chat. Very helpful information in there. And I know Shay will also put page numbers as I'm referring to information. So feel free to take a look at that. Maybe even download it right now so you can have it up on your screen. So we're going to get into some strategy. And I think this is important as we get started, really understanding the purpose of the interview. So I want you to share, what do you think the main purpose of the interview is? Again, there's advanced preparation. When you have an understanding of the why, it's much easier to get to the how. So let's talk about why the interview exists. What's the purpose of it? And there is an answer I'm looking for. It's not just one right answer, but again, taking some steps in the interview. We'll get to the specifics. But what do you think the purpose of the interview is? It may not be as obvious as you think. And you can respond in chat, please. All right, and sometimes I'm seeing answers come directly to me. You can share with everyone, it looks like as well. To you, it's more of a sales pitch, okay, the interview. So it can be a sales pitch as you're talking through the interview, but what are you trying to accomplish then? So what's the main purpose that you're trying to accomplish in the interview? Okay, someone said to get the job. Okay, so that is perhaps correct. Now I'll just give you a perspective. What happens if you interview and you're not really looking at this position anymore? Maybe you're going for an informational interview and you really don't want the job. That may not be the ideal outcome. Okay, I love it. To see if you're a good fit, similar ideas or ideals. Okay, so similar values, if you will. Person applying is also interviewing the company, right? So it's a dual purpose. You're checking the company out. They're checking you out. Again, right fit, good match. Michelle, you mentioned to share your background, accomplishment, if the fit will work for the needs in the role. Excellent. Excellent, excellent. So here's the main thing. You want to be highly favored in the interview. So your purpose is really to be the one that is perhaps selected for the offer. So to get an offer would be kind of what I'm looking for there. It doesn't mean that you have to accept the offer or it's to get the job. That would be many times what our goal is, right? You want to get the offer for the job and say yes, perhaps. But finding right fit, I think, is a really great answer, because determining, is that the right fit for you and are you the right fit for them? So that's a good starting point, really, when you think about the why, because you want to come in with some really good questions. You want to come in with some strategy. I've talked to people recently that said, I had a really bad interview experience. I wouldn't work for that company if they offered me the job. I get that. I've had a couple of interviews like that. And that's legitimate. I mean, you really are evaluating them as well. So I think I saw a hand raised. Maybe not. Okay, it's not there anymore. Okay, so really thinking strategically about that. So as we get into some preparation, if you will, the purpose of the interview is all the things you mentioned. Showcase your personal brand. We didn't specifically say that, but that's really also what you're doing. You're selling yourself in terms of putting your best foot forward, sharing highlights of accomplishment, and what you have to offer. Someone mentioned sell yourself. That's again listed there. To differentiate yourself from competition, why are you the best candidate? Looking at right fit, positioning yourself, your experiences as solutions to their challenges. So what can you offer them to validate this is the right opportunity? And right fit would be a good word choice in there too. So these are all good. And again, the thing that I think is important is that you come in with that focus of it's a mutual decision, right? So let's look at that. What are they using sort of as a criteria to select the candidate that they want to offer the job to? Well, as an interviewer, they want to know, can you do the job? Do you have the skills? Do you have the knowledge, the experience? So competence is what we're identifying there. You can see there's 4 C's. This makes it easy to remember. But they also want to know, can you do the job here at this company, in this department? And so you're equally interested. Is this going to be the right fit for me in terms of the right environment and the right company? Am I going to be empowered in this role? Am I going to be able to do this job and keep up with the skills? Is it going to challenge me? So there's the competence and compatibility from your side too. Chemistry is about the people. So think about people you work with right now. Does that make a difference? It sure does. So when you think about connection to people, when you're in an interview, connection can be through how you communicate, your approach, and answering questions with answers that are relevant to your listener. So body language can help you make those connections. Posture, how you present yourself. So when the interviewer is looking to see, can you do the job with us? They're looking to see how well fit you would be with the team, and they're assessing your communication style. And you're also doing that, right? You're looking at how they might be communicating back with you. If you're in an interview and the interviewer is distracted by their phone and they're really kind of rude, you're probably not going to want to say yes if they were to offer you the position. May even be a real turnoff that you wouldn't come back and interview again with that company. So these are all things that you want to also evaluate. And hopefully you're not going to have a negative experience. And if you do, you'd be willing to overlook that when interviewing with somebody else, because that may not be, the standard at that company. The last one is compensation. Often people will say, well, how do I respond when they ask me about salary? It depends on the question. So if they ask you previous salary in your role right now, you don't need to respond to that. You would just ask them, well, I can tell you more about the range that I'm looking for. Or you might turn around and ask them a question about what's the range for the job that you're interviewing for. But there really isn't any relevance to them asking you what you're making in your current role or your prior role, because that's not the job you're interviewing for. right? So the job you're interviewing for has a salary guideline, and it's helpful to know what the range is. If it's not posted on the position, then you certainly can ask them what the range is. But here's my recommendation on that. So recruiters are really very keen on this, and many times they'll ask you the question so that you'll give them information first. But it's better for you to kind of flip that around so that you get the information from them first. Because if you give them a number, they're going to hold you to that number. So you want to give a range, but you also want to maybe delay giving that information so that you can get information from them. So I'll tell you a little bit more as we go along what that would look like. But the compensation, usually you want to wait till the recruiter asks, and then maybe you turn around and ask them a question. So compensation shouldn't be the focus of any interview. And so, but it is part of the interview, and it helps set the stage for getting offers, because you don't want to be boxed in. You want to keep the door open based on what they say. Okay, and you want them to be competitive. So that's another thing. Doing some research can help you with that. So it's pretty clear here if you look at those 4 things: competence, compatibility, chemistry, compensation. Write those down. Those are the premise for all questions you're going to get in an interview, unless it's a psychological question, but then they're also looking for something in relationship to one of those. You just don't always know what it is. If they ask you a question like, so what books are you reading? They're just wanting to get a sense of your interests, and maybe that's a chemistry thing to make a connection, or even what your drive is, and are you compatible with some of our core values of the company. So again, you don't always know what of the 4, but I can tell you every question is going to fit in one of those 4 categories, and you'll want to have questions too. So we're going to talk more about that. And as we go into it, we really want to think about the brand. And for those of you that were in the resume writing session, we did talk about this, and we talked about the 4 areas of building your brand. So I'm just going to review those. The first is know yourself. What are your skills, your experience, your education, your knowledge base, all of the strengths, all of the things that you would use to describe yourself, just in general. And then what is the second area, the differentiating aspect of your professional experience? So how can you make that impression with your listener? Sharing your value proposition. How do you introduce yourself? What's unique about you that you want to get across in an interview? First impressions matter, and you want to make that good first impression. So value proposition outlines what you have to offer and how you solve problems, what solutions you drive, what skills and expertise sort of bring value to the organization. Communicating your brand. In an interview, it's really making that connection, kind of leaning in, and I physically just lean forward there, right? But thinking about leaning in is being a good listener, sort of really paying attention, asking good questions that might help them also know your sense of curiosity, your drive to perhaps even look at some of the aspects of the job and learn more. So communicating your brand can be on social media, right? In the interview, it's verbally being able to communicate that. So with that, here's an example of the branding message. But what I want you to do is focus on how would you introduce yourself? Questions in an interview, typically one of them is, tell me about yourself. And although that's technically not a question, they'll have you set the stage and say, so tell me a little bit about your background, or tell me about yourself, or walk me through your resume. So if you've had those questions. So let me pause here, because I know this is kind of a lot to look through if you've not seen this slide. But let me ask in chat if you could respond to this question. How long has it been since you've had an interview? Or you've actually, now you've probably had many conversations. This could be a more formal, maybe informational interview, but just a conversation about you. You've been talking about your skills, what you have to offer. How long has it been? Just send me a quick chat. And if you want to include in that your title, That's helpful because we are going to be talking about different kinds of questions you're going to get. I had some executives on the call this morning. You'll get different kinds of questions there, a lot about leadership, about your strategic approach, your vision, and as far as other leadership roles, again, all of that can contribute to the types of questions you get, but they'll probably ask some pretty specific questions even about your experience with regards to not that role itself, but the skills needed for that role. All right, this is helpful. Thank you. I see quite a few of you, 16 years. Okay. Over 2 years ago, a year ago, 5 months, 15 years, 4 years. Okay. Those of you that said more than, we'll say 4 years or more, because that's a majority already. You're going to want to practice different kinds of questions so you can build your confidence. It doesn't mean that you're not going to be able to do well at all without practicing, but when you gain practice, you're going to have a much stronger, I'll say, confidence and posture moving into an interview. And those of you that haven't had interviews in a while, you may not even know what to expect. So this is going to be helpful today with getting insight to different kinds of questions, but it hasn't changed significantly. I would say the biggest things that have changed regarding interviews are the brevity of most interviews. It's shorter, maybe a half hour, not always, but they're going to be pretty quick, asking questions. And it can also be the amount of interviews. So you can have a position where there's 5, 6 interviews before they make an offer. And that's a little more common today because they're really interviewing and sorting through sometimes 200-300 candidates. So that's what I've seen change recently. And there's a lot of video conference interviews. And of course, that technology has become more and more available in the last, more and more available in the last 5 years, but we've had it for a while. That's really, I think, a good way for companies to get more interviews in and to be efficient with their time and their money, because they used to, fly people all over the country to bring them in for interviews. Today, they can do a lot of that video conference and then, do final interviews where they're bringing people in. So thank you for that. Now we're going to move on to the next state, the next page, where there's an example of a branding message. So if you were to ask to introduce yourself, you might not say something necessarily like this, but this is a great example of somebody, this is an executive that's a leading salesperson, and they might introduce themselves as a risk taker. They drive business to the next level. Their application of enthusiastic confidence generates new customers and competitively positions products. You want to be able to show value. In these statements, we hear value. They're consistently overcoming obstacles, generating product loyalty, increasing the company's profits, and global market recognition. I hear like 4 or 5 different things that describe value. Now, you're going to want to think about your messaging before you say it, and that's the value of actually writing it out and being prepared. Because when you're starting in an interview and they want to say, or they ask you to tell me about yourself, you're going to probably be introducing yourself, making your first impression, and you want to capture what's essential for them to remember. Because typically, let's say you have a half-hour interview, they're going to remember the first 5 minutes, and they're probably going to remember the last 5 minutes and a few things in between. They're not going to remember everything, but they're probably going to take notes. And again, you're going to make an impression with the stories you tell, the way that maybe you connect in the interview. If there's something, maybe it could even be something you noticed on LinkedIn about them, something that connects you have in common. Okay, here's another example. Oh, sorry, no other example. Let me call the J on that one. All right. Yep, this is another example. I have a couple things of blocking my screen there. Perfect. Okay, so this is a customer service person. I know we have some people this morning, a couple in customer service, and this one is letting them know, they leverage their knowledge of product line, leading customer service platforms, facilitating customer inquiries. So what do? They solve problems for individuals. It comes natural to them, and the results maintaining stellar quality scores. This is the impact and the value to the company. And again, kind of highlighting some of the things they're known for. And that's pretty good too. I like that. So what you have to know is, what does your audience want to hear about you? What would be interesting enough for them to know about what you have to offer? All right, so one of the ways that you can do that strategically is to give examples of the way that you've done work, the way that you've accomplished things and added value. In this morning session, we talked about writing statements that describe accomplishment. The source story is the model for that, and your statements are action and results. But in the interview, you're really going to be talking with your listener, right? So they're going to ask you questions. And typically today, interviews are a little more interactive. It's not just you answering questions and then firing away with, them asking, you responding. There's going to be more dialogue. But when you have to, or asked to give examples, you want to give some good examples, not what you would or could do, but what did you do? So here's some examples. Briefly describe a situation or a project you managed. Okay, now what are they looking for? They want you to tell them a little bit about that project. So let's say, I'll give you an example, and I'm going to follow the SOAR method. And by the way, thank you, Shay. This is on page 3 in your participant guide. If you can come up with one right now and write it down, please do that, because this is important. So when you think about a situation, last year I was asked to deliver training for a product launch where a system was changing for consultants to use. And we needed to train a group of 500 consultants worldwide. And the problem was, we had about a 2-month time frame before launch. The design of the site was not complete, and we had a low budget. So we went into the project knowing that. What did we do? So I'm kind of walking through a little bit more, because I probably wouldn't say in an interview, well, what did we do? Right? So you would say, so we got the stakeholders together and we put together the priorities for the training. What would that roadmap for the training look like? What was the best way to incorporate this training for the participants to, access it? Instead of live classes, we did recordings. They were micro learnings that we could push out and they could listen to. And so we were able to do that. We were able to change up a training if something changed on the design of the site, but we gradually released each one as a build to the components of the website. As a result, we got 100% compliance. We had all questions answered before launch, because we also offered Q&A. We had frequently asked questions provided throughout, and ultimately we're able to deliver training on time, under budget. All right, now I explained that a little bit more than I would giving an example in an interview, but I described a situation that I manage, or a project that I manage. So you can see, when you're using a method like this, it allows you to answer this in a way that is going to provide the information they need, and it's also going to allow you to be more concise. So comments or questions about that? Again, you can use chat. You can also, if you want to raise your hand, Shay will unmute your calling and you can speak out. One thing I will tell you is when, whenever I've talked with recruiters, and I've also had training as a recruiter, one of the reasons that examples of accomplishment are so powerful is because they validate your skills, and they show also the listener how you fit into that role. So almost psychological dissonance, where they see you now as that person that they would select for the role. Again, if you're the right fit based on the examples that are relevant to the job, they may see you as the perfect candidate for the position. Okay, no questions, we'll move on. So the second one, and I won't go through all of these, but you know, where you're challenged with a question like, tell me about an obstacle or challenge you face. Well, in many cases, all the examples are going to have some challenge, right? So that's the idea, is right, that there's an obstacle to climb. So if you're asked a question, you'll be able to figure out what examples would make sense for your listener. So a challenge could be a timeline, restriction. It could be a budgetary constraint. It could be, something where, the relationship is at risk. So what's important to your client, or I should say to your audience? If risk management is part of what they're hiring you to do in that role, then that's where you focus, is what your audience cares about. So what action did you take? That's in line with everything here. As you think about each one of these SOAR steps, if you will, in this acronym, these all come together. And again, some of those wouldn't be separate questions, but they could be relevant to what your audience asks. Now, the questions that are relevant, any kind of where they're asking for examples, will be referred to as a behavioral question. Now, in my opinion, this is the best type of question to ask, because then I'm hearing about that person's experience. Now, I've heard this many times by recruiters, that behavioral questions validate. So they validate the skills, they validate the experience that person has. And the more they can talk about their experiences that relate to that role, the better chance they're going to get an offer, because they're really positioning themselves as the right candidate. So there's some different ways to do that. Part of it is understanding what your audience is looking for. If you're not sure, you can ask them, what are the top 3 pain points that they have? What are the top 3 challenges they're faced with that they'd like to solve in the first 90 days? Ask some really good questions where you can position yourself as that candidate coming in to solve problems for them. So there's no secret. These are asking for examples. So tell me about a situation, a tough manager, supervisor, describe a situation or a time, give me an example, for instance. So anybody have some unique questions? Again, behavioral questions are very, very common. You'll even hear many times behavioral interviews. They're pretty much all behavioral questions, if you will. But anybody have a really good question you've been asked before that's a behavioral related question? And keep in mind, as you're thinking as well, what kinds of questions would you ask so that you can position yourself with great examples? So either one of those is great. So behavioral questions, I'll just give you an example of a tough one that it's mentioned here. Tell me about a tough manager or supervisor. What would you say there? You give an example of maybe how you helped resolve a situation, how you contributed to the success of whatever the situation was, where you may have talked with the manager, resolved things moving forward, maybe gave them some insight to how to solve a problem or what to do with regards to a solution with a client. So think about what you might be able to highlight in your example. Right. So I think we're good there. Going to move on. So again, in your participant guide, there is a lot of reference to some of the slide information. I'll just mention here, this is what I've been talking about, the style of interviewing. We'll call it these traditional versus strategic model. Most interviews today are more strategic. They really should be, because you should be looking at the company from a standpoint of, would I want to work there? Is this the right fit for me? Is this, the type of leader I want to work for? And then also that's what they're looking for. So traditional is more them asking questions, you responding. Strategic is both sides asking questions. And for the most part, also getting insight to, why is the position open? What are some challenges they're faced with as an organization? they're looking for support. What do they want to accomplish in that first 90 days? Those are really good ones. What are some of the needs in the organization? So having more of a discussion. So let me just pause here for a moment because I know some of you have had some recent interviews. I know for some it's been a while, but those of you that have conducted interviews and those of you that had recent interviews in the last year, would you say that this is true regarding strategic interviews? Has that been your experience? That can be a yes, no question. Just chat. I'll look for your response. Okay, no. So I had someone say no. Okay. A couple no's. All right. I see a yes. So it makes me sad a little bit hearing no, because that is a lot more effective having a strategic interview. So if, again, that hasn't been your experience, make sure you're bringing questions to the interview and ask them maybe even at the beginning of the interview. I have some questions with me today that I'd like to ask. When there's a moment, I'd like to jump in with those questions. So, try to make that happen. That's a good way to do it. So I did see a couple of those. All right. So strategically, you want to have some ownership in that interview, and really give them the benefit of the doubt, because not all interviewers are going to have a lot of experience interviewing. And you'll see that if you have a negative experience, I would guess that's probably somebody that doesn't have a lot of interview experience, and you can get that. All right. So types of interviews. Now, most of you have probably experienced different types of interviews, and I'm going to be talking about 8 different types. If you see something here you've never experienced, you're welcome to drop it in chat. I'm going to tell you about all of them briefly. So an informational interview is you inquiring with questions related to somebody maybe that you know. This can be a networking interview too. Those are right side by side there. But informational would probably be somebody that would give you a better understanding of the industry or how business works. And maybe you got their name from a referral. So that's a little more informational related. Networking is like who you might go to for finding out what they know and who they know and getting referrals. So there's usually people where there's relationship here. So either way, in both situations, you're introducing yourself, you're meeting new people, you are networking. At one maybe just a little more formal on the informational side. The screening or phone interview, pretty typical. You're going to experience that usually in a first interview with a recruiter. They're trained to go at it pretty quickly. So their questions will, I'll say, fire away pretty quickly, and that can be a very fast-paced interview. They're going to be asking you about your resume. They might ask you about your compensation range for salary. They may, really initially want to know why you feel qualified for this position. So, really the key is to make an impression by highlighting your key qualifications, make sure you answer their questions, and, give them something to remember you by, if you will, in terms of, maybe some accomplishments that really stand out. Video interview, like here today, I know Shay and I are the only 2 on video, I think, but you want to make sure you dress professionally, and again, your body language communicates professionalism, but also smile and ability to connect to people is based on smile, based on posture, also, being a good listener, reflecting back to some of the things perhaps that they've said, affirming. But you want to also, now I'm looking directly at the camera right now. So on occasion, you see me look in different places on the screen because I've got things in different places. But in an interview, you definitely want to put the pictures close to the camera so that you're looking directly as close as you can to the people that you're talking to. But again, face forward, because if I turn over this way and I'm distracted, it's obvious that I'm distracted, and I may be looking away because maybe someone comes in the room or whatever. You always want to be, focused in the interview, make sure that you're limiting also your body language. Now, I use my hands a lot, but I keep them at waist level for the most part. So on camera, you're not seeing that movement. It can be distracting, although today we're really real time. There's not as much of a delay, so it's not as distracting, if you will. But sometimes it can be if you're using a lot of hand gesturing. So video can also be recorded video, a little different than webcam. And that's something that I've seen in some interviews. It can be on government jobs. A lot of times you'll have video um, recordings and others as well. So that's not uncommon. A panel interview is very common for companies that do a lot of collaboration, and that the purpose of the panel interview is to get people involved that are part of those collaborative efforts. So it could be, a matrix style organization, or you've got a number of folks that are going to have a vested interest in who they select because they're going to have a lot of interaction with that person. So 2 or more is considered a panel. You're going to develop rapport with them. You want to try to make a connection. If you know who's going to be in the interview, you want to look them up on LinkedIn to get familiar with their background. You might even do a little bit of research that would help you in asking some questions related to maybe their perspective. Behavioral interview we talked about. Using the source stories is always great for any kind of interview, but especially for behavioral interviews when you're asked to give examples. And a case study and scenario are very similar, but here's the biggest difference. The case study is for perhaps someone that's going to do a lot of presentations. So they want to see, how do you present? How do you communicate? How do you think through and put together presentations? If you're someone that negotiates contracts, or you deliver or will deliver presentations, this is typically a type of interview where they can assess those skills that you have. So, the tips in here can kind of help you in the planning if you're going to have that type of interview. And usually, if you're not sure, just ask the recruiter, what type of interview am I scheduled for? If you want, again, this is not usually information that's kept from you. Now, a scenario typically in an interview where they're going to say, like, here's a potential scenario, again, could be very similar to a case study where they're asking you to come in with a solution to a problem. A scenario would probably be a little bit lower scale on that. You're going to pull from your experiences. And again, scenarios, examples, you really doing that in behavioral interviews, but this is maybe more focused on different kinds of challenges that they want you to share. So very similar though to behavioral interview. So any questions or any additional types of interviews that you've experienced that you don't see listed there? So one more point on the scenario is that sometimes, unlike the behavioral questions, the scenario, you might not have experienced that scenario before, but they're saying, should you experience this, how would you handle it? And so you have to be able to give an example of maybe some of the things that you've done in the past that might parallel what you maybe will do. So that can be a little different. Okay, well, let me give you a few tips along the way. This is going to move pretty quickly in terms of the tips because, there are things that you can pick up on, and some of the things you already know, self-explanatory. Now, the things I want to emphasize, though, for a screening or phone interview, please don't do this interview driving. If I'm a recruiter and I've got somebody that it sounds like they're driving, I'm going to ask them to either pull over or, what this condition is. So I don't want them driving while they're doing the interview. But again, sometimes that's unavoidable. But you want a quiet place. You want to make sure your battery on your phone doesn't go out while you're on the call. Make sure that, again, if driving, you could lose reception. Of course, you could lose that in a home or wherever you're at too, but just kind of know the conditions of where you are when you're interviewing. Even if you smile in a phone interview and they don't see you, it matters. Like, I'm smiling right now, and you can usually tell it sort of uplifts someone's voice. I used to teach a course called Put a Smile in Your Voice. And if you're smiling and you're talking, usually your voice is happier. It sounds much more energetic as well. We used to teach that at Disney because, again, people want to talk to happy people when they're making their reservation for their hotel rooms and such, or their vacation. So putting a smile in your voice, it does come across that way when you're talking, even if there's no video on. Sometimes standing up. Now, I'm not standing today, but if I were standing up, I would be able to have more capacity in breathing and being able to maybe even speak louder. But I do have good posture. I'm straight up and down here. And that's not only for camera, but that's also so I can articulate and I can, be able to express myself with pretty good volume. I actually have a pretty soft voice. So in projecting, I want to make sure that, again, I'm getting good air in my pathways. I know that may sound a little technical, but it is important. Speaking slow enough, being concise, and not always filling the space with something to say, but making sure, and I tried to pause for questions. In an interview, you want to just pause, get the reaction, and then just see what maybe come next. And again, this would be a little different for a recruiter interview. They're moving at such a fast pace. You might not necessarily, you will get the reaction, but you may not necessarily get a lot of pausing in between. They may jump into that next question. But typically in interviews, there's going to be some silence. All right, so let's take a look here. Video interview tips. Nothing unusual here. You're going to test the technology, make sure your background's good. Video backgrounds, virtual backgrounds are pretty common today. I have a virtual background. Some people think it's my office. I wish, but my office has a wall behind me. But, again, this is good to be able to have a variety of different professional looking settings. My wall looks fine, but it's a little more boring than having an office look. You want to dress nice, look nice for your interviews, be personable. If there's any distractions, I will see sometimes, and I've seen this in interviews too, where somebody's pet will walk in the room. Now, sometimes that can be avoided if there are circumstances, whatever, but be sure that there's not distractions that are going to throw you off in the interview. That can cost you the interview. I've had people tell me that that's happened to them, and it's really hard to get back in the groove when you feel like it's, something happened in the interview and they're just not going to give you another chance. So, very good tips, again, just to kind of think about prior to interviews when you're planning. The stages of the interview, there's 5 stages. The simplify it, think about planning, preparing, and practicing. But in the preparation phase, you want to do your research. This is on page 4 of your participant guide. Your research on the people you're going to interview, the company, the job, why it's open, what are some of the solutions perhaps they're looking for. So as much research as you can, finding what's in the news, talking to people gathering information from the job posting, doing your research on other job postings the company has open, things like that. Write your questions down. Anyone want to throw out a really good question you've asked in an interview that's been really helpful gathering information? I've mentioned a few already. What are you hoping to accomplish in the first 90 days? Asking if you don't already know, why is the position open? If it's a growth opportunity, can they explain a little bit more about the growth taking place in the next year? So anyone have a good question that you ask in interviews that's been helpful to you? What does success look like for a person in this role? That's excellent. Excellent question. So you can really have clarity around, well, what does that mean to them? If someone's successful in that role, what do you need to maybe do or accomplish to have that kind of success? Just it adds clarification. Good. It's a good one. Looking at the job description, of course, important, being camera ready, all of these things. Bringing copies of the resume if you're going directly to an interview. That can be helpful, again, just to show your preparation and then make sure your files and documents and so on are in order. The introduction. Now, this is part of, the day of the interview, probably the half hour before the interview. Arrive early if it's in person. Make sure you're courteous to people. There may be a few of you that have had this experience. I've had this a number of times going to meetings where I don't know the people I'm meeting with, but I've looked them up on LinkedIn. And so I might know when I go into the building, I recognize a face. That's probably somebody in my meeting. But before we had LinkedIn to do that, I didn't always know. And I would be in a meeting or headed to a meeting, and I would meet up with somebody that I had talked to on the elevator, or I had seen in the parking lot and had some conversation with. So that's not unusual. Just be courteous to everybody. Don't cut anybody off in the parking lot if you're going somewhere. Obviously, that could be somebody that you're going to meet up with in an interview. So, when you meet people, eye contact, posture, a firm handshake, again, showing your interest in them, listening, building rapport. The dialogue for the interview, usually they start that. Okay, they're going to ask you, tell them about you. Be prepared. Try to be concise with your answers. I often will get this question. So how long should I, take to respond to questions? Give me your thoughts on that. How long do you think you should have to respond? Of course, you can go on and they'll probably cut you off at some point, but is there kind of a guideline? Give me your thoughts on that. I'll give you a guideline that I think is very realistic and also probably a close expectation. Anybody want to give it a try? 1 to 2 minutes per question. That's really, really good. Yes. So I would kind of look and aim for 1 minute. Now, if you go over, perfectly fine. I wouldn't make 2 minutes your goal, because you'll sometimes spend too much time dancing around the response. Sometimes you can give an answer, maybe give an example, and you're done. That's a minute. So think about commercials. They're 30 seconds. Really, you want to get to the point pretty quickly. So aim for the minute. You go a little over, it's fine. Be observant with the body language. Keep that eye contact. Sometimes they'll want more information, and you can go a little bit longer, like with your intro, but try to keep it about a minute. Listen carefully to their questions so you can respond and sort of, like I said, hit the target. Make sure you're answering the question. This is fourth, closing. So closing the interview, again, this is all part of the interview. So you got the introduction, the dialogue, the closing. The 3 things that you can do, and it doesn't say 1, 2, 3 here, but explain that you're interested. Just share your interest. I'm very interested in this position. It sounds like my qualifications, give 3. My qualifications of presenting clear communication, negotiating contracts, and managing projects that are aligned with your learning objectives would be the strongest qualifications I bring that make me a good fit for the position. What's the next step? So I did 3 things. I affirmed my interest, gave them 3 of my top qualifications, and asked what the next step is. And those are the 3 things to have an effective close. The last thing is the follow-up. And as far as kind of that process goes, you have been given the information, right? Because you asked about what the next step is. They can likely give you a very vague answer, but see if you can get a date. See if you can get more of a firm answer. Make sure you send a thank you via email is fine, but send a thank you within 24 hours. Thank people for their courtesy, their time, gather information, make some notes, and just, reaffirm that next step if you need to in the email. So that's the thank you. Just confirm, look forward to hearing from you. As you mentioned, make selections on Friday or by Friday. I look forward to hearing from you around that time. They're sometimes not going to get back with you that same day, but just providing a clarity. All right, let me pause there. Any questions that you have? Sometimes I'll get questions about dress code. You can ask the recruiter what to expect. You're typically going to find a lot of interviews. They don't expect you to dress formally, like in a suit for ladies as well, but, just look nice. But you want to make an impression. So again, you want to stay within kind of their dress code, but make sure that you look like you made an effort to look nice and again, a clean look, no spots on your clothing, shine your shoes, things like that. And I say that because you've got people that will look at all the detail. So it depends on really what you're interviewing for, but pay attention to them. All right, some standard interview questions. So, and by the way, we're coming up on an hour. We still have this as a 90-minute session. And so I want you to make sure you're asking questions here in chat, and we'll ask for your feedback. So in just a little while, Shay is going to drop a link for filling out the eval for today's session. Again, it's a 90-minute session. Hope you can stay on because this information is so valuable once you get scheduled for interviews. It'll really help you and start preparing now so that you can take one step and then another step to get yourself in a position where you're more confident. So page 6 of the participant guide has some information on standard interview questions. So let me just share. These are some great questions to ask. So tell me more about key priorities for the role. Mentioned earlier, what does success look like? I love that. I don't think that one's on here. I've heard that before. I think it's a really good one. Understanding expectations and what are their metrics for measuring success. That's really going to give you that answer. Most of these are really pretty baseline. Ideally, as a candidate, you can ask questions that demonstrate you research the company or research the role. You can share insight based on what you've learned. As a candidate, you can look on, of course, social media, blog posts, LinkedIn about the company, see what's happening within the company, just to gather more information so it can help you. For example, when you research a company, a SWOT analysis, SWOT, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, is a report that you can look at to see where the company might have some pain points. What are some strengths that they offer? Again, where you might be able to fit in to some of those details. All right, so good questions to ask. And then what kind of questions will you get? These are pretty common. And, as you look at your participant handout, these are in the handout. But let me ask if you would, is there anybody here today that has put together their positioning statement, their branding message? There's a lot of similarity to that terminology. Your elevator pitch. How would you introduce yourself? Anybody want to speak up on that? Feel free to raise your hand. We'll make sure you can come off mute. Anybody want to say that? So that if you're asked in an interview, so tell me about yourself. What would you say? So this is not necessarily a memorized response. This is going to have, parts to it that will differ based on your audience. If your audience, let's say you're interviewing for a project manager or leadership role, you're going to probably focus on a lot of your leadership qualities. Whereas if you're interviewing for a more technical position, you could focus in that introduction and your message on some of the aspects that some of the qualities that you bring technically, depending on what you want your audience to remember about you. Volunteers. All right. Any questions here that you would like to respond to, feel free to write the question, write your answer, or raise your hand. I'm going to walk through a few of them. The second one, I get a lot of questions on that. So why are you looking to leave your current role? You can indicate that as a result of, McKesson making some changes, looking for some new opportunity. You don't have to give too detailed of a why. What the recruiter is looking for is, how are you processing this? And it might even be, if you already left a position, why did you leave? Again, they're just looking for any red flags. There's not a red flag unless you create one that says, I really had a hard time working with that leader. You're not typically going to do that. But in talking about, why you left, it's a reorganization. It's, positions were eliminated, things like that. Do you speak about your impact by the layoff? Yes, you were impacted by a layoff that also involved another 300 people, something like that. So the main thing you could add in that was not performance related. The layoff was based on the economics or the finances. It wasn't performance related. So that you could share, absolutely. And the main thing then is you move the conversation forward. So as a result, I've focused in on looking at companies that are innovative and they've got some great opportunities for growth in the future. And that's why I'm interviewing here. I'm really excited about what your company is doing. Kind of get your focus on the company you're interviewing with. Why do you want the position? I've heard people say it's a job. Is that going to turn me on about why they want to be hired? Not really. You want to have reason that's going to really stand out for your listener. So why do you want this position? My qualifications make me the best candidate for this position. Again, you have to be bold enough to say those things that are going to show them why you are the strongest candidate, even if you don't know who else has applied. You're talking about your key qualifications. Now, your goals, if you don't have any that you're thinking of, you want to put some together, like where would you like to be in 3 to 5 years? This is about adding value to the company. Maybe the value is your contribution. What do they care about? If it's compliance or mitigating risk or making their sales numbers, that's where you want to show your focus. 5 years, they may be just looking to see how long your commitment may be. And again, there's no guarantee, but look for giving clarity around some of the goals that you have. Maybe it's to, make a significant contribution, but what kind? Don't just be general with that statement. And then maybe it's about learning and growing and earning a certification or advancing into perhaps new roles where you can add more versatility with your skills. Again, it should be more about the company and the value you can bring than about you and the promotional opportunities. So how you would craft that is important. Weaknesses, strengths, how would you respond to those? Why should we hire you? Again, you want to present yourself as the most qualified candidate. Why not? You want them to know that you're a strong candidate for the role, if not the best candidate for the role. All right. Any questions does that bring up today? Okay, I know you're processing, so we'll keep going here. Difficult interview questions. This is typically questions I'm seeing here that are not asked in interviews, but on occasion you'll see a few. So now the first one is something that I've heard many times, like describe a failure or mistake or a time your work was criticized. The main thing you're looking for there is, how do you handle feedback? How do you handle failure? What would you say? What would you do? So you want to learn from it and you want to move forward. So, trying to identify that with examples. Maybe when a project didn't go as planned, what did you do? And how did that work out? What did you learn from it? Maybe the learning can point to something valuable that happened in the next assignment. And then what did you like most and least about your last manager? So you're not giving names of people. And maybe you're saying, in a prior role, you're not necessarily, if somebody you're interviewing with knows who the last manager was, maybe you can just say in a prior role and you're not pinpointing that person. Or you got to focus on the what did you like most side, or what did you learn from them? It could be something on either side. The learning is the key. And sensitive questions are the ones that you typically do not get in the interview, but you could. And so you can redirect your interviewer. So how old are you? That's typically there's information on the application. They shouldn't be asking your age. They shouldn't be asking about your family, and they shouldn't be asking about your ethnic origin or religion or political nature. So those are things that typically are not really encouraged in the interview. In some cases, there's even laws applied that that's not allowed. So just be aware even of some of the things that, you can actually look at the Department of Labor sites and typically find, what the laws are in your state on things, employment law. You can just do a search on employment law in Florida or whatever to get more information. But the point isn't that. The point is, if there's a question asked that's very uncomfortable or it doesn't seem appropriate, redirect. Well, that brings me to a question that I have. Would you mind if I just jump in with a question? Or, I have a question for you. Can you tell me a little bit more about the position and how this may be even relevant to the job? Again, you're asking a very fair question. You don't want to necessarily confront that person and say, this doesn't seem like it's an appropriate question. You may just redirect them. Now, salary expectations, a very legitimate question. So what would you say? So what are your expectations in terms of salary for this job? How would you respond? I'll give you 3 options. So you see this in your participant guide. It shows you 3 words you can think about when you're asked information about salary. So defer, inquire, reveal. So the salary question is really never fun, but you're guaranteed to get it. So when you do some research, it's helpful because you'll have more confidence when you respond, but you do have a few options here. So the defer means you acknowledge, but then don't necessarily give them a straight answer on it. Before we discuss salary, could you share with me a little bit more about the job position or the responsibility or the growth potential of this role? So you're kind of redirecting them back to the job description, and it's a legitimate question because it may be like, I would want to know about the decision making, like how much, what's the weight of responsibility? What are some of the, maybe are there direct reports? Are there certain responsibilities that are not clear in the job description? You want to get clarity before you negotiate a salary. So, and the best way to prepare yourself for a salary negotiation is to get clarity in the interview. So this is really part of that. So the inquire, where you ask a question, it can be, I'd like to learn a bit more about what the range is for this position if we want to talk about salary. And they might say, well, give me what your range is. So they may redirect you back. So if that's the case, give them a range rather than a number. And the range should be based on some of your research. So if it's a project manager role, it's with a big company, you probably have a good idea where the range would be, or maybe it's already on the job description. Okay, and then think about your qualifications where you're in a mid-range. Usually you've got a lot of experience, maybe 5 to 10 plus years, maybe an advanced degree, licenses, certifications. All those things add more value in terms of where you may be placed in the range. But I'll tell you, most recruiters will not want to make offers above the mid-range. So that can be based on your unique experience, and wherever you can highlight that unique experience going to help you showcase your value more so you can get a higher offer. So giving a range, never talking about your prior salaries based on what you were making or what you're currently making if you're still working in the interview. It's not relevant. It's not something that's really any of their business. They're only asking that because they want to know what's your expectation. And most people will expect to make the same on their money. That may not be the case if you're pulling back. If you're looking to go part-time, or if you're just wanting to have more balance and you want to change the priorities of benefits, where maybe salary's less, but you're working remotely. So those things are all make a difference in terms of your negotiation, what's important to you, what you want to have that conversation about. And again, that's not typically going to be a lengthy conversation in an interview, but if they ask, it's fair game and you can certainly respond, just keeping that door open. And the last thing on the very bottom of that slide says, I'd like to learn more about the total compensation. Could you share that with me? So that could be if they're asking a lot of questions, or even if they make an offer in the interview, that's not unheard of. They could make an offer, and I've had a couple people that I've been coaching that's happened to. And I've told them over and over again, if you get an offer in the interview, you could really get an offer in the interview. Tell them thank you, get the information, ask your questions, but don't accept right then and there, because you want to process that. And wherever people have not listened and they've accepted, usually I've heard them come back, oh, I should have asked for this, or I should have asked this question because I didn't get all the information, and then they have regrets. So it's not a bad thing. You want them to know your interest. Thank you so much. That's exciting. I'm really looking forward to working with you. I do have a few questions if you would mind answering, and then what I'd like to do is get back with you tomorrow with my response, for accepting, the position. So again, they're clear that you're not saying yes at that moment, but you're excited. Get all the details that you need. Make sure you get it in writing. And so anyway, that's part of cultivating the offer in the interview, because you could get an offer in the interview, but your questions and how you respond will determine sometimes whether they're turned on or turned off. So you don't want to give them too much information about what you're looking for in benefits, because you want that. You want to be the selected candidate that gets the offer. And then you are the person that they see in the role. That's the psychological dissonance about it. Now they're visualizing you in that position. So I don't know if you've heard that before, but again, just kind of thinking it through. You want to be the choice candidate, and then you can evaluate from there. Did I get my questions answered? Is this the right fit for me? You don't want to mislead in the interview, of course, but like if you've already accepted a position and you're just interviewing for a little more practice, and you're already set with that offer, I would let them know you have an offer on the table and you're interviewing because this was already scheduled before that offer came up, and not give them any details about the offer. But like you're saying, I'm legitimately interested in that role. They may say, well, what would it take for you to pursue this opportunity? And again, they may not necessarily do that, but you want to be as honest as you can without giving too much information. So sometimes if you're interviewing for quite a few positions and you accept an offer, I would typically wait until you completed those interviews, if you can, give it a little extra time before saying yes to an offer. But I realize there's excitement when you get an offer. Just don't jump in right in the interview and say yes. You want to give it 24 hours so that you have time to ask your questions, get them answered, so that you can really see, is there something I would like to negotiate? And maybe you discover, I had somebody accept an offer this summer that was a teacher, and they negotiated some flex time, and that worked out really well. They didn't get it written down, but they actually did get one flex day, not the two they wanted. But what happened was they didn't get in writing some of the other things regarding the benefits. And so that whatever did not happen. So, it partly was because of, benefit structure and so on that was different than what was expected. But you always want to try to get the information answered, get the questions answered, get the information written down so you can be pretty clear about what to expect going into a new role. All right, so you always present your best self in the interview. And how do you do that? I mentioned earlier, body language, that's important too, good first impression, but it's also important all the way through the interview. And this kind of gives you statistically the value of body language. If you look at that, now this is from a research study at UCLA that determined that people determine their opinion of others, not just by words, but body language and tone of voice. And as you can see, the study concludes that body language is 55% of the information people receive about you. The tone of voice is 38%, and words are just 7%. Well, I kind of giggle a little bit because when I tell people, make sure you practice your interview questions so you know what you're going to say and so on. That's more for confidence for you than it is about, hitting it right on the mark and saying things perfectly. Because if people make a connection with you and they like you and they feel like you're the right candidate, it can be they're reading that body language as a connection. The voice tone, voice inflection, it may not be as much about the words, but it's all part of the delivery. So kind of check yourself, are you coming across positive? Maybe even, again, practice, get some feedback from people, are you enthusiastic? Are you speaking loud enough? Are you, presenting yourself in a way on video that's good? There are several interviewing resources that you'll find. And again, as you participate eventually, again, in some different accessing resources, there's quite a few. If any of you have LinkedIn Learning, there's some interviewing resources there and so on. But take advantage also with the LHH program. There's many interviewing tools and resources when you begin with that. So dress for success, you can see there's a variety of dress codes showing up here, but they all look fairly professional. But I would say this is a little more casual right here. This is a little bit more formal. That could be executive attire. That could also be someone interviewing for a leadership role. This is a little more casual, but you do have a nice pants and jacket. I don't know, maybe that's socks, but again, it looks a little more casual. But kind of just finding out what is the expected dress code for the area, based on the environment, if you will. If it's video, again, you can just wear a nice shirt and you're usually okay. They say dress up for the interview though, so that you have that confidence level going into the interview, which I agree. I think that's good. After the interview, so lots of things that are valuable. First, and probably the one I think of the most, is the thank you. All right, be honest with me. Last interview, if you can remember, how many of you sent thank yous after the interview? And you may not necessarily even remember if it's been a long time, but it's courteous to do that. You did. Excellent. You did. You made a difference. That is really good. I have talked to hiring managers and I will often ask, so in these interviews, how many people are sending thank yous? And they're usually saying less than 50%. So you're making a difference and making a really good impression by saying thank you for your time. Thank you for, again, sharing, the opportunity. So excellent. How do you ask for feedback if you're not offered a role? So recruiters sometimes will respond with that. Sometimes, again, I know from being a recruiter, a lot of times we couldn't give specific feedback. We'd have to say something like, well, we had other candidates that were more qualified. So it will depend on maybe their policy, what they share. If it's somebody that sometimes they will give you some feedback on that, but some companies just don't provide any additional feedback. mean, you can always try and reach out to the recruiter and ask if they have any feedback that would be helpful. So I would really practice with some other folks that can give you feedback. And then when you get to the interview, try to evaluate it as fairly as you can from your own perspective without being too hard on yourself. What maybe did you pick up that you could do a little differently? And it could be, something that you noticed, and you may still get selected for the job, but it helps you learn as you continue to pick up on things. So you're sending a thank you, you're writing some notes, you're evaluating what worked well. Maybe again, that next step, you're contacting references. Now that could be more if the interviewer is asking for references. Typically, they'll verify degrees, they'll ask for maybe 2 references. And again, the follow-up usually is with the recruiter. If you get contact information from the hiring leader or the hiring manager, you want to follow up with them if they're giving that information out. But a lot of times your contact is the recruiter. So there's a lot of tips, and I'm just going to give you a few, some of the do's and don'ts. And again, I believe this is also in the participant guide. So some of the things that you do, I mentioned, turn off any distractions. If that's, kids playing in another room, make sure you've got a do not disturb sign on the door, or it's locked, or I don't know. You again want to make sure that, honestly, I have a dog. So I do have somebody in the home that takes care of the dog when I'm on webinars or I'm on phone calls, so that I'm not disturbed. I've got my door shut. So, many times, again, there may be certain things you can do, and sometimes there's interruption. Just go with it. Sometimes there's a technical challenge you're not expecting. Just go with it. And how you adapt can make a difference too. So we're human. We're going to have things that come up. So just try to plan ahead. Turn off any cell phones, obviously, that are going to distract you or ring. Make sure you dress professionally, be pleasant, all of these things. Close the interview, as I mentioned, with the 3 things: your interest, your qualifications, your asking for follow-up. Some of the don'ts. Now, you don't always think about these things, but you don't mention people's names in the interview, people that you've worked for and such. Now, somebody mentions a name and they ask you, do you know this person? I mean, heard that in an interview. It may just be, oh, I used to work at this place. Did you ever know this person? That's fine. But you're not going to use examples with people's names. You want to make sure you don't interrupt, but definitely get some questions in. Now, I just did that. Using expressions like, that can really be distracting. Sometimes it's common. I hear it in a lot of sessions that I am part of, whether it's someone I'm talking to one-on-one or in a meeting. It's fine, but you want to make sure you kind of monitor that. So I know I do it on occasion, and you want to maybe even record yourself, or that's why you want to get feedback from someone so that you're not doing it on a regular basis. Because if you use a word like right or frequently, it can be very distracting. So the interviewer says, let the interviewer's casual approach fool you. Now, what I take from that is that you do want to get comfortable in the interview, but don't get too comfortable. Like, you don't want to have a lot of casual conversation. You don't want to be telling jokes with the person, although you can make them laugh. You can tell a funny story as it relates to the interview, but just be careful you're not getting too comfortable that you're, saying things that might not be professional. That's the best way I can put that. I mean, you kind of know what I'm talking about. Just being careful that, this is an interview. Just remember that. So always be on time. Don't exaggerate, especially numbers, qualifications. Answer questions, sometimes redirect. And remember that, in fact, knowing the role of the person you're talking to, really important. So if you know this person's the decision maker, you're going to ask different questions than if you're talking to the recruiter or you're talking to somebody that might be, it could be a peer, or they could be somebody a couple levels up. So asking more about vision, strategy. Good question, Shonda. What if the interviewer is like that with you, like they're chummy or they're very casual? That happens. I mean, just relax and answer questions, but just be you, but don't get too casual back. I mean, maybe that's hard to do, but again, you are going to have all styles of people communicating differently and so on. You want to make sure that you settle into a style where you can connect with them, but you're not too casual, or you want to be authentic, but you also want to not freely share too much that could be personal information. Again, this is where you don't necessarily want to share a lot about your family or any specific things that could be a distraction from them making a choice about you. So that could be different for everybody. I hope that helps a little bit. All right, I'm going to pause here because we're almost finished. Oh, good, it does. What are some challenges maybe that you're faced with interviews, or maybe difficulties that you have in your preparation for interviews? So I've shared with you a couple of things: plan, prepare, and practice. Those are some really 3P guidelines for getting ready for interviews. We talked about the SOAR method of talking through accomplishment stories. And we also talked about the 4 C's. Who can tell me what those are? Competence, compatibility, chemistry, and compensation. So again, that's the basis of really all questions, discussion in the interview. So that's super important to remember. All right, any challenges, anything that you have a question on? Now's a good time. We're getting really close. In fact, my next slide says thank you. Keywords in the resume. Well, that's the resume session, but I'll touch on that real quickly. That can help you get interviews if you have keywords that draw in your reader. And it's really more for the applicant tracking system. Will they address that in an interview? Yeah, a lot of times that can draw people in to ask questions about your skill set in the interview, but that's a question specifically for the interviews or for the resume session. Keywords are important. You'll hear that often. You want to have a lot of keywords related to your industry, related to your profession, related to transferable skills and any technical skills, as well as leadership skills and trending topics. What else? Thank you, Shay. Shay shared the link for completing the evaluation. If you would click on that before you leave, and you should keep that, you'll be able to keep it open. Would love your feedback. Any feedback you have in chat would also be kindly appreciated, so I could see it. I don't always see the formal feedback in the form until later. So anything you'd like to share, would love to have that shared in chat. And any questions that you have also. To me, that's super important in answering your questions, because I know you have expectations coming here. You just spent 90 minutes. Well, I hope that you learned something, and I hope that you'll be able to apply that information as you move forward with interviews. So let me ask this question then. What's different about how you'll approach preparation for the interview now that you've attended this session? What's different for you? What will you do differently? What will you be more aware of? What was helpful? What's your takeaway? Those are all the same. What was the value add for you today? Now you're also welcome to speak up. We do have about 5 minutes. Okay, thank you, Amanda. Better understanding of how to close it out and follow up after an interview. Excellent. What if you're an introvert, not great at patting yourself on the back? Well, you have to be able to market your message. So you really have to practice that. I know it cannot be easy. But you have to be able to talk about yourself. If you think about, somebody selling a product, you're not going to buy the product unless you know what are the features, what are the benefits, how is this going to help me? So you have to be able to articulate that to other people about yourself. Yeah. Yep. Shonda, you learned about how to answer questions, share your branding message. Excellent. Jeffrey, you said you'll be more prepared overall due to research, how to answer specific questions. Good. Great. Kenneth, you said learn more about the behavioral questions. Yeah. Good. Yeah. And, I would recommend putting together many source stories, if not like a couple dozen. I mean, at least a dozen, because when you go into an interview, typically, if it's a half hour, you're going to get at least 10 questions, 7 to 10 questions. If it's a behavioral interview, most of those are going to be behavioral questions. So get yourself ready. Having 7 to 10 source stories for any interview is going to prepare you well. Overall, you want to write as many out as you can so you can practice and you're comfortable going into an interview with lots of examples. All right. Well, I think we are close to the end here. And again, a big thank you for your time today. I'm glad this was helpful. Your feedback was really helpful to us in terms of what you've learned and really the value you've gained from today's session. And if you do have any questions, I'll be here for another minute or so. Thank you. And yeah, if you have any more questions, I'll catch those. Have a great night, everybody. Take care. And thank you, Shay, for all your